So Noam Chomsky went on Democracy Now! And he weighed in on RussiaGate. This is awesome. Let's watch.
There's a focus on what I believe are marginalia. So take, say, the huge issue of interference in our pristine elections. Did the Russians interfere in our elections? An issue of overwhelming concern in the media. I mean, in most of the world, that's almost a joke. First of all, if you're interested in foreign interference in our elections, whatever the Russians may have done barely counts weighs in the balance as compared with what another state does openly, brazenly, and with enormous support. Israeli intervention in U.S. elections vastly overwhelms anything the Russians may have done. I mean, even to the point where the Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, goes directly to Congress without even informing the president and speaks to Congress with overwhelming applause to try to undermine the president's policies. What happened with Obama and Netanyahu in 2015. Did Putin come to give an address to the joint sessions of Congress, calling on them to reverse U.S. policy without even informing the president? And that's just a tiny bit of this overwhelming influence. So if you happen to be interested in foreign influence in elections, there are places to look. But even that is a joke. I mean, one of the most elementary principles of functioning democracy is that elected representatives should be responsive to those who elected them. There's nothing more elementary than that. Now, we know very well that that is simply not the case in the United States. There's ample literature and mainstream academic political science simply comparing voters' attitudes with policies pursued by their representatives, and it shows that for a large majority of the population, they're basically disenfranchised. Their own representatives pay no attention to their voices. They listen to the voices of the famous 1%, the rich and the powerful in the corporate sector. The elections, Tom Ferguson's stellar work has demonstrated very conclusively that for a long period, way back, U.S. elections have been pretty much bought. You can predict the outcome of a presidential or congressional election with remarkable precision simply by looking at campaign spending. And that's only one part of it. Lobbyists practically write legislation in congressional offices in massive ways. The concentrated private capital, corporate sector, super wealth, intervene in our elections massively, overwhelmingly, to the extent that the most elementary principles of democracy are undermined. Now, of course, all that is technically legal, but that tells you something about the way the society functions. So if you're concerned with our elections and how they operate and how they relate to what would happen in a democratic society, taking a look at Russian hacking is absolutely the wrong place to look. Well, you see occasionally some attention to these matters in the media, but very minor as compared with the extremely marginal question of Russian hacking. And I think we find this on issue after issue. Also on issues on which what Trump says, for whatever reason, is not unreasonable. So he's perfectly right when he says we should have better relations with Russia. Being dragged through the mud for that is outlandish. makes Russia shouldn't refuse to deal with the United States because the U.S. carried out the worst crime of the century in the invasion of Iraq, much worse than anything Russia's done. But they shouldn't refuse to deal with us for that reason, and we shouldn't refuse to deal with them for whatever infractions they may have carried out, which certainly exist. This is just absurd. We have to move towards better. Right at the Russian border, there are very extreme tensions that could blow up any time and lead to what would in fact be a terminal nuclear war, terminal for the species and life on Earth. We're very close to that, and we could ask why. First of all, we should do things to ameliorate it. Secondly, we should ask why. Well, it's because NATO expanded after the collapse of the Soviet Union in violation of verbal promises to Mikhail Gorbachev, mostly under Clinton, partly under first Bush, then Clinton expanded right to the Russian border.
You know, for the past few weeks, actually probably more than that, but definitely more so in the past few weeks, I've been looking at the national conversation. I've been looking at the meltdown that everybody seemed to be having on Twitter over that press conference with Putin and Trump. And it really felt to me like there was some sort of collective psychosis going on. Almost like all of political Twitter was having a psychological breakdown in real time. And, you know, we were watching it happen. And it was really strange to me because even people that I respect, I was watching them go down this rabbit hole of what I think is genuine conspiracy theory. And it's tough because you feel after a while, you know, just by asking for evidence and not swallowing the mainstream media narrative whole, you feel marginalized and you feel lonely and you're like, damn, am I the one that's lost my mind? Or is it that I'm looking at how everybody's reacting and I really think they're unhinged? Which is it? Am I the one with the problem here? Because, again, all I feel like is I'm asking for a coherent explanation of RussiaGate from the biggest proponents of it, and I've just never been convinced by their explanations. And I don't see the evidence. Now, again, this isn't me saying, like, I'm against Mueller's investigation completely. I'm not. In fact, I look at what happened with Manafort. I look at what happened with Flynn, and I think Mueller did a good job. And I think the money laundering and, you know, Flynn representing the Turkish government without registering as a foreign lobbyist, I think those are totally real stories, real crimes, and I support Mueller going after them. So I'm not saying Trump isn't involved in corruption. I'm not saying that there aren't aspects of his administration, factions of his administration that are doing the bidding of foreign governments. I just have never been convinced of it on the issue of Russia. And when everybody else seems so convinced, I'm like, I don't know how they're that convinced, number one. But number two, I don't know how this has become so goddamn pervasive that it's like I'm one of like 3 or 4 voices that's going, yeah, still not convinced. But now Noam Chomsky comes along, he talks about this on Democracy Now!, and it's almost like he just reminded me that I'm not crazy. And I watched this and I was like, oh, okay, good. Thank God. So somebody else who I really respect and look up to, and he was a big influence on me even getting started in doing what I do. And he soberly analyzes it, and I go, oh, okay, good. Thank you. Because that's similar to my breakdown. So first he says, okay, so the issue is interference in elections. That's the issue. That's the thing that everybody's like, oh, Russia's interfering in our elections. He goes, even if you accept that as this is something that's like really important that we should all be focusing on ad nauseum. Now, even if you do accept that, I think it's still fair to say there's been way too much coverage of this compared to other issues, like the fact that we're participating in a genocide in Yemen gets no coverage. But putting that aside for a second, except that this is, okay, this should be covered extensively, and it's really important. Well, Chomsky points out, the interference from Israel is worse and happens more than the interference from Russia. So again, even if you accept that premise, that we should really all go nuts at interference in our elections, even though we interfere in everybody else's elections, and it's a given that they're going to try to interfere in our elections, and this is just par for the course in international politics. But even putting that aside, again, being as kind as we can to the opposing point of view, Chomsky points out, but the interference from Israel is just way worse. So I know that when you say this stuff, people accuse you of whataboutism, but here's the thing, man. How can you not account for interference from other countries, especially if that interference is orders of magnitude worse? And that's what he's pointing out. So we discussed it before, but when President Trump was President-elect Trump, Israel contacted his administration and told them, hey, you're going to go to the UN and you're going to try to block this resolution that condemns our illegal settlements. And they tried. And, remember, Jared Kushner got $30 million from Israeli banks. So they're taking money and they're doing the bidding of this government, and they're directly affecting policy. And this, again, was when he was president-elect, not even president yet. And then, you look at what happened with the Jerusalem embassy move. Is there some monetary exchange there? Well, I just told you, Jared Kushner took $30 million from Israeli banks. I'm sure there's other people in the administration also taking that money. So, and then they do a policy that no other administration would do, but the Trump administration did. That's a very provocative policy. That's exactly what the far right of Israel wants, and that also ruins any potential for a two-state peace deal down the road. Could be some massive corruption there. Saudi Arabia is another great example. Saudi officials give Trump $300,000 when they stay at his hotel for a few nights. Why are they paying that much? Well, they're paying that much because they were buying access and they were buying policy they want, like the over $100 billion weapons deal that Trump approved for them. Trump registered 8 new businesses in Saudi Arabia on the campaign trail. Then he gets in power and he gives them whatever the fuck they want. He went from calling them responsible for 9/11 to giving them over $100 billion weapons deal and aiding in their genocide of Yemen. So again, if you interference in our elections, foreign governments controlling our politics, you have even worse offenders. Even if you agree that that premise is absurd and we got to cover it all the time and melt down, you have worse offenders. Because the strongest argument made against Russia is that they were responsible for releasing the DNC emails. So they released the DNC emails. By the way, they didn't make the DNC rig the primary against Bernie Sanders. They didn't make Hillary Clinton and Debbie Wasserman Schultz be insanely corrupt. They didn't make Donna Brazile leak debate questions to Hillary Clinton. Corin made a great point about this. He said, if the leaks didn't uncover anything, they wouldn't have affected the election. So if the DNC wasn't rigging the election, well, then the DNC email hacks and leaks would have been useless. So you're getting mad at the people who are telling you about the rigging as opposed to the rigging itself. That seems fucking crazy to me. I made the comparison recently to Edward Snowden. Now, it's not exactly analogous because Edward Snowden was doing it as a matter of conscience. So he's like, this is the right thing to do to show everybody how the government's spying and taking all your information. And it's a violation of the Fourth Amendment and the Constitution. So Edward Snowden released information that should have been released out of conscience. Russia did not release the DNC stuff out of conscience and they care about what's right. No, I think they did do that because they preferred Trump to Hillary. But at the end of the day, either way, we should have seen those emails. We should have seen those hacks because it exposed primary rigging. So I'm more mad at the people who rigged the primary than the people who told me that the primary was rigged. Because I'm not fucking drinking the Kool-Aid and going down this rabbit hole of insane conspiracy theory and scapegoating. So now, by the way, does this mean that, we shouldn't take any action in response to what's going on with Russia and their election interference and all that? No. That's not, no. I would lead the charge. If I was a senator, I would lead the charge. I would immediately propose a cybersecurity bill, and I would immediately propose paper ballots. Why? Because that's how you try to protect against this kind of stuff happening again. Okay, so let's do that. But you'll notice something, guys. Every single proponent of RussiaGate that shrieks and yells and screams and goes nuts and points the finger and scapegoats all day long, and they won't stop talking about anything but RussiaGate and the attack on our democracy. Go ahead, you check. How many of them talk about paper ballots all the time? How many of them talk about a cybersecurity bill all the time? They don't even talk about the fucking solutions. So that's how you know this is all being used for political gain. It's because they don't even fucking talk about the solutions. You would think that if you were really so concerned about election interference and, oh my God, we got to make sure this doesn't happen again, that you would lead with the policies that would prevent it from happening again, and that would be your main focus. But no, they don't talk about that at all. And all they want to do is harp away on the problem without giving a solution because they're using it for political gain. So it drives me crazy that people who I respect have gone down this rabbit hole and are not thinking logically about this. And then again, so final point is Chomsky brings up concentrated capital. And that means, big business, multinational corporations, billionaires, lobbyists. He says, if you care about interference in our elections, that should be your first concern. Because just because we've made that legal doesn't mean it's any less real and any less egregious. So when you have a situation where in Congress, 93% of the time, whoever raises the most money wins, well, then you understand why our system's so broken. Because those people raise money from big business and corporations and billionaires and lobbyists, and then they turn around and only do policy that favors those lobbyists. So we have an oligarchy. That's what we have. They're representing the moneyed interests. There was a study from Princeton that came out a while ago that said, indeed, we function as an oligarchy. So if you care about interference in our elections, you should be screaming about Big Pharma and the military-industrial complex and Goldman Sachs. Way before you get to Russia releasing some DNC emails that proved that they were rigging the election. So it's just the priorities are all fucked up. And I lied. I have one more point. The Democrats have now put themselves in this position. Anytime Trump does a reasonable policy when it comes to the issue of Russia, they will scream that he did it because he's Putin's puppet. So they will position themselves as de facto against any reasonable policy vis-a-vis Russia. So do you understand that? It's a very important point. Let's say Donald Trump says, hey man, looks like we're on the brink of war. I don't like that. I'm going to remove the U.S. warships from the Black Sea that are right on Russia's border. I'm going to get rid of the NATO troops that are right on Russia's border because that's a giant escalation. Imagine Russia put troops on Mexico's border with us. We'd be like, scramble the jets. We're going to war. That's what's happening right now. But we can have NATO troops right on Russia's border. We can have U.S. warships in the Black Sea right on their border. And if Trump were to decide, I'm going to get rid of those troops. I'm going to de-escalate. We're going to do peace talks and negotiations, and we're going to make it so that we have a functioning relationship with Russia, and we move away from war, the brink of nuclear war at that. Immediately, every single elected Democrat in the country would scream that he's only doing that because he's Putin's puppet, and you need to not do that. So we're going to have, in the 2020 election, we are going to have the most perverse incentive we've ever seen from the Democrats on foreign policy, where they're all going to be competing for who can be more hawkish and who can escalate more on the issue of Russia. And that's what drives me nuts. Is that now policy is not even in the conversation because we're so busy hurling accusations of treason and traitor and calling people Putin's puppets that even if you propose the policy that Democrats should favor, peace talks, negotiation, not escalation, not increase sanctions, well, then now if you do those things, that's obviously evidence that you're Putin's puppet. So we're in favor of a permanent standoff and permanent escalation for rank political partisan reasons. And that drives me nuts. And I've tried to be as clear as possible about this stuff from the beginning, man, where I stand on the policies themselves. And what I can say is this. I support the sanctions over the Crimea situation. So that round of sanctions, I'm totally fine with. But outside of that, I would not have U.S. warships in the Black Sea. That's a disgusting escalation, and that's an unstable act. I would remove the troops from NATO's border, and I would immediately try to open up a line of communication and have genuine negotiations and talks. And listen, both sides on this have legitimate bones to pick. I mean, obviously Putin's upset because there was an agreement that the U.S. not move towards Russia's border anymore with NATO, going back to the collapse of the Soviet Union, and we did exactly that. So they view that as rank aggression from the West. So they have a genuine issue there with what the West is doing. Now, the West, we can genuinely be upset about how he annexed Crimea and just took it and said, man, and, what he did in Georgia back in the day. So there are real issues there, but this is why you need to talk. This is why you can't have a toxic political environment where the Democrats are begging Trump to be more hawkish and standoffish with Putin. So I told you guys a million times, I'm a policy guy. That's what I care about. And so that's why this frustrates me so much and why I think this is so damaging. Is because now, even if Trump were to do the policies that I think are the most reasonable policies, every elected Democrat in the country would be against him and say, how dare you do that? That's scary. That's fucking scary. So Noam Chomsky, enlightening as always here. And, if you're somebody who has had serious disagreements with me on this whole RussiaGate thing, maybe you'll pause a little bit more and it'll make you think a little bit more when the person who's making the argument, it's not me, but it's, one of the most world-renowned intellectuals of our time, if not ever, Noam Chomsky.